And now it's time for this hour's news review. Russia has a word of caution for participants on the upcoming talks in Vienna aimed at restoring the 2015 nuclear deal. Russia's top negotiators warning against any move which can complicate the resumption and successful completion of the negotiations. Mikhail Ulyanov made the call in a tweet following a fresh round of U.S. sanctions against Iran, this time targeting its drone program. Tehran has slammed the move as contradictory to the U.S. administration's claims that it wants to rejoin the nuclear deal. The former U.S. administration left the deal in tatters after abandoning it in 2018 and reimposing anti-Iran sanctions. In an effort to revive the agreement, Iran and the remaining parties to the deal have held several rounds of negotiations, which are set to resume by the end of November. Iran insists the talks will be successful only if they lead to the removal of sanctions. I'd like to welcome my guests to this news review. Marcus Papadopoulos, author and historian out of London, and Keaton Mansfield, author and analyst from the Center for Political Innovation out of New York. Thank you both for being with us. Marcus, starting off with you. I mean, what do you make of this? On the one hand, Iran had talked to some of the parties and said it was willing to return to sit and talk, of course, dealing with the same structure of before and not renegotiating anything new. That happened, and then we saw the United States then sanctioning actually Iran now this time around for drones and drone technology. I mean, what do you make of this? Do you think that the U.S. really wants to return to the deal or not?
Well, firstly, Joe Biden has no intention whatsoever of returning America to the JCPOA. After all, Biden is a self-professed Zionist, which means that he, in particular, has no love, no affection, no respect for the Iranian Revolution, which freed the Iranian people from Western subjugation. I said time and time again on television and in speeches from the very moment, from the very day that Biden took office, that those commentators, those analysts who were arguing that America could return to the JCPOA under Biden never corroborated their contentions with any evidence at all. Secondly, by America, whoever is sitting in the White House, be it Biden, be it a Trump, or be it whoever will succeed Biden, America will use the argument, it's very, very weak and unsubstantiated argument, that Iran has not fulfilled its obligations as set out under the JCPOA in order to intensify Washington's economic war against Iran. Because all objective commentators, all impartial analysts have made it abundantly clear that Iran has fully complied with its obligations under the JCPOA. But as I said, by America alleging the opposite, that provides a very convenient cover to policymakers in Washington to increase, to intensify sanctions on Iran by simply saying to the American public and to other publics in the world that Iran is in breach of a very major treaty and therefore sanctions have to be placed. But the reality of it is this: will these sanctions have an adverse effect on the Iranian economy, on Iranian military technological development? I very much doubt so. Why? Because Iran has a strategic partnership with Russia, and Russia, of course, is a superpower. Furthermore, Iran has a very close political, economic, and military relationship with China.
Okay. Well, Keaton, your take on all of this. I mean, on the one hand, we hear American politicians, especially the Biden administration, talking about returning to this JCPO. I mean, you heard Marcus there in London saying basically he doesn't think that they want to return to the deal. Your take on this, and if you agree with him, then what is this all about? If they don't want to return, then why continually bring it up? Just move on and say it didn't work out. Your assessment of what's going on.
Well, I tend to agree with my colleague here that the U.S. has no intention to return. However, I think the reason that it keeps being brought up, despite the last two administrations being very blatant in their policies and the way they move forward, that there is no intention to return JCPOA, is it makes Iran look like the bad guy. If it can be continually brought up in U.S. media, if it can be highlighted every time there's the discussion of Iran or there's the discussion of the unjust sanctions that is being put on Iran, if the U.S. media and the U.S. administration within the presidency and the other houses of government are able to point at Iran and say, look, they're not holding up their end of the agreement. They're not holding up their end of the deal, which of course is untrue. But to the American people, it sounds like the U.S. is trying. The U.S. is extending the olive branch to Iran. And these crazy extremists across the sea are the ones who are preventing any progress from being made, when in fact it's the opposite. When it's Iran who is wanting peace. It's Iran who is wanting freedom and liberation for the Arab world, for the Eurasian world, for the Middle East, and it's the U.S. that wants to continue to push instability. It's the U.S. that wants to continue to make the forces and the powers that don't align with American imperialism and don't align with Zionism look like the bad guys.
Well, Keaton, staying with you, I mean, given with what you've just said, that basically they want to create this negative image about Iran to the American people, but dealing with the administration itself, dealing with the actual, we want to say, political elite, at the end of the day, do you think that they have not realized that after basically over 40 years of sanctions against the Islamic Republic, Iran is still standing strong and getting stronger every day? At the end of the day, do you think that they can break Iran with adding more sanctions or not?
I think the answer to that is yes. I think it's very similar to the situation that Cuba is in. Iran and Cuba, in many ways, have a very similar modern history of revolution and throwing off the chains of imperialism, and as a result, the U.S. sanctioning those countries like crazy, like never before seen. And I believe that the elites of the U.S., that the administration, that the Biden and Trump regime thought that if they added one more sanction, they would finally, it'd be the straw that broke the camel's back, and finally Iran would cave in, or Cuba would cave in, and allow the U.S. and the Western powers to come into the country. But that's not what has happened. In fact, it would appear that these continued sanctions and aggression from the U.S. against Iran has only strengthened the resolve of the Iranian people and has only strengthened their faith in the Islamic Republic and the Islamic Revolution.
Okay. Marcus, your take on that. I mean, it is quite amazing, can I say, that after 4 decades of U.S.-led sanctions, that still it appears that Washington does not understand that the more you try to intimidate a country, the more cohesive that entity becomes in trying their best not only to survive but thrive.
Indeed. Iran in 2021 is stronger than it has ever been before following the 1979 revolution. Indeed, Iran has influence and power not just in the Middle East, but further afield. So, for instance, Iran has a strategic partnership with Venezuela, and that partnership played a role in preventing the Americans from carrying out coups in Caracas. But I believe, at the same time, American policymakers are acutely aware that history teaches us that all is possible. Who thought the Habsburg Empire would collapse? Who thought Tsarist Russia would collapse? Who thought the Soviet Union would be dissolved? Therefore, the Americans look at Iran with the opinion that whilst Iran is becoming stronger, anything is possible. That is why more sanctions on Iran can only help to achieve America's objective of suffocating the Iranian economy and thereby bringing down the Iranian government. After all, more sanctions on Iran or establishing more terrorist training camps in Albania, upon which terrorists are trained in that Balkan country and then sent to Iran, is not going to harm America's endeavor to destroy the Iranian revolution. It can only help. However, at the same time, the Americans are very aware that Iran at home is strong and becoming stronger. The Iranian economy is very robust. Iranian society is united, and Iranian influence and power is growing in all manners abroad.
Okay.
But of course, the Americans will rely on history, and history teaches us that all is possible, and therefore the Americans will continue in their quest to destroy the Iranian revolution and to return Iran to how it was under the Shah, effectively a colony of Washington's.
And on that note, I'd like to thank both of you being with me for this news review out of London. Marcus Papadopoulos, author and historian, and out of New York, Keaton Mansfield, author and analyst for the Center for Political Innovation. And thank you, viewers, for staying with us on another news review.